Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Before the story begins, make sure you've subscribed. It's completely free, and it ensures you'll never miss a jaw-dropping twist or thrilling adventure. Your support means everything to us. It fuels our passion and helps this storytelling community grow stronger every single day. Wishing you a day full of peace, joy, and inspiration. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental. This story is created solely for entertainment and does not promote or glorify violence in any form. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. When the Galactic Council chose fear, they didn't see what they were planting. Not chains, but roots. Not dominance, but seeds of resistance. Generations later, the very species they sought to control would rewrite the future, not with vengeance, but with vision. The Grand Council chamber stretched upward in elegant curves of metal and stone, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow far above. Tier upon tier of seats rose in concentric rings, each occupied by representatives of the galaxy's greatest civilizations. Their forms varied widely, some with scales, others with fur, still others with thick protective plates or rubbery skin. The air hummed with translation devices and climate controls, maintaining a precise balance for hundreds of different atmospheric needs. Representative Karnak's clawed feet clicked against the polished floors as he approached the central podium. His species had evolved from apex predators, and it showed in every deliberate movement. Backward jointed legs ended in hooked talons, while his elongated skull bore rows of sensor pits that allowed him to detect the slightest changes in temperature or movement. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonic undertones common to his kind. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, manipulating the holographic controls with practiced ease, "I come before you with grave concerns about a newly discovered species." The image of Earth appeared above the chamber, a swirling marble of blue and white. They call themselves human, and they represent a unique threat to galactic stability. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as data began scrolling besides the image. Atmospheric composition, gravity, average temperatures. But Karnak's focused on different numbers. In the past solar cycle of their world, they have engaged in over 50 distinct armed conflicts. Their technological progress is almost exclusively driven by warfare. When they split the atom, it was to create weapons. When they reached their moon, it was to win an arms race. Even their greatest medical advances came from treating battlefield injuries. In his private box, Grand Duke Fieseldorf shifted uncontrollably, his streamlined form settling deeper into the cushioned seat designed for his cetacean-like anatomy. His aide leaned close, whispering something that made the Duke's blowhole flutter with concern. But their violent nature is only part of the problem. Karnax continued, bringing up new images, human skeletal structures, moon cell density analysis, environmental adaptation studies. They are capable of surviving in nearly any environment. Their endurance exceeds that of 90% of known species. Their ability to process toxins and heal from injuries is unprecedented and most concerning of all. He paused for effect. They adapt, not just culturally, but physically. Their bodies grow stronger in response to hardship. Their minds develop new solutions with terrifying speed. Given time, they could become unstoppable. The Duke's aide was frantically taking notes now, but Fieseldorf's attention remained fixed on the images. He saw something different in them. Potential, yes, but not necessarily for destruction. We have two choices. Karnak's voice took an edge of urgency. We can wait until they develop interstellar travel on their own, likely through more warfare, and face whatever they become. Or we can act now, while they are still primitive, and ensure their strength serves the galaxy rather than threatens it. The chamber erupted in discussion. Representatives conferred with their advisors. Diplomatic channels hummed with private messages, and prediction algorithms ran countless scenarios. I propose. Karnax raised his voice above the den. That we take control of this species now. Their physical capabilities make them ideal for labor that other species find difficult or impossible. Their adaptability means they can work in environments too hostile for most. Under proper guidance, they could become a tremendous asset rather than an existential threat. The Duke rose slowly, his massive form commanding attention even from several tiers up. And what are their potential for peaceful advancement? Their capacity for art, music, philosophy? Are we to condemn an entire species to servitude based on their capability for violence rather than their demonstrated capacity for growth? Karnak's sensor pits flared. With all due respect, Your Grace, we cannot risk the stability of the galaxy on the hope that they might choose peace. Their history speaks for itself. Their history speaks of survival, Fieseldorf countered, his deep voice carrying neutrality throughout the chamber. Every species here evolved through conflict. We all bear the marks of our violent past. Would any of us wish to be judged solely by our worst moments? But the Duke's words found little support. Already, representatives were signaling their agreement with Karnax. The economic possibilities alone were swaying many of the merchant species, while the military powers saw an opportunity to gain an advantage in ground forces. The vote, when it came, was decisive. Screens throughout the chamber display the results. Overwhelming support for immediate intervention and control of humanity. Only a handful of systems, led by Setitian Baroness, registered the opposition. As the chamber began to empty, Karnax approached the Duke's box. I hope you understand, Your Grace. This is for the greater good. Better to guide them firmly now than face them as equals later. Fieseldorf's blowhole released a soft spray of vapor, his species equivalent of a sigh. I understand only that we have chosen fear over faith, representative. I pray we do not live to regret it. The Council has spoken, Karnak simply replied, then turned to leave. The Duke remained in his box long after the chamber emptied, watching Earth's image slowly rotate above the empty podium. His aide finally touched his arm gently. Your Grace, the transport is waiting. Yes, Fieseldorf said softly. It always comes down to transport in the end, doesn't it? Moving things or people where others think they belong. He turned away from the image of humanity's homeworld. Send word to our commanders. When the invasion comes, we do what we can to minimize the bloodshed. After they left the chamber, the Duke's powerful tail dragged slightly, a sign of deep weariness in his species. He had stood against the tide of opinion before, but never with such a heavy heart. Somewhere on that blue marble below, humanity was going about its business, unaware that its fate had just been decided by beings they didn't even know existed. The Duke could only hope that some part of their spirit would survive what was to come. Lady Marisol Fieseldorf stood at the viewport of her family's last remaining estate ship, watching supply shuttles drift between burnt-out orbital platforms. Earth's atmosphere still showed traces of the invasion, streaks of ash where cities had burned, great brown swaths where desperate measures had scorched the land. Even now, 2 years after humanity's surrender, the planet bore its scars openly. Her sleek cetacean form felt awkward in the formal robes of mourning. The dark fabric caught on her dorsal ridge, and the ceremonial collar chafed against her blowhole. But tradition demanded proper attire, even, or especially, when receiving news of further losses. The Crimson Baroness have formally revoked our trading rights, her aide, Polino, reported. His own smaller frame showed signs of stress, skin dried out from too many hours in recycled air, flukes drooping with exhaustion. Without those roots, we cannot maintain even this reduced fleet. Marisol finished. The words tasted bitter. How many ships can we keep? 3, my lady, including this one. She absorbed the news in silence. 3 ships, down from the hundreds that once proudly bore the Fieseldorf banner. Her father's opposition to the invasion had cost them dearly. Allies turning away, trade agreements cancelled, subtle political pressures becoming overt attacks. Now the Grand Duke was dead, leaving her to shepherd the remnants of their once great house through the aftermath. A quiet chime interrupted her thoughts. The new arrivals are ready for inspection, my lady. Marisol straightened her robes. Time to face another consequence of defeat. The holding bay had been converted from a cargo area, its high ceiling still bearing the marks of heavily atolled atmospheric controls. 20 humans stood in a rough line, wearing simple gray tunics that marked them as newly processed laborers. Their guard, a brutish, cracked thigh with overlapping plates of horn, stood far enough back to make it clear he feared no escape attempt. "These are the ones from the mountain settlement?" Marisol asked, studying their faces. Humans were so expressive, their features mobile in ways her own species could never match. "Yes, my lady. The Carpenter family and their associates. They held out longer than most. Clever lot. Using the caves for shelter made them hard to find until hunger drove them out." A tall human male stepped forward slightly, not quite breaking formation, but making himself noticeable. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held steady as they met hers. "Marcus Carpenter," he said simply. "I speak for my family." The guard moved back to strike him for speaking out of turn, but Marisol's fluke slapped the check with a sharp crack. "That won't be necessary. I prefer my workers whole." She moved closer to Marcus, noting how the others tensed protectively around a cluster of younger humans. Family solidarity. Something she understood well. "Your people fought well," she said quietly. "We lost," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, you did." Marisol turned to address them all. "I am Lady Marisol Fieseldorf. You are now bound to my house, what remains of it. You will work, but you will not be abused. You will serve, but your families will remain together. This is not kindness. This is practicality. Broken tools serve no one." A younger human woman spoke up, her voice carrying a trace of defiance. "And what if we refuse to work?" A guard tensed again, but Marisol remained calm. "Then you will be sold to houses that care less for practicality." That cracks thigh, perhaps. They always need replacements for their mining operations. Few survive more than a year in their tunnels. She let that sink in, watching understanding spread through their expressions. They were intelligent enough to recognize the choice being offered. Harsh, but survivable service. Or a slow death in the mines. Marcus spoke again. "We'll work, but I want your word, your personal word, that my family stays together." Marisol met his gaze. In his eyes, she saw something familiar. The same desperate determination she felt, trying to hold her own house together. "You have it." The word of House Fieseldorf still remains something, even now. She gestured to Polino. "Get them settled in the habitat wing. Full medical screening, proper nutritious, and... She paused, considering. Access to the educational databases. If they're going to serve my house, they should know its history. The guard's expression showed clear disapproval, but he knew better than to object. As the humans were led away, Marisol noticed Marcus glancing back at her. Not with hatred or fear, but with something closer to evaluation. Like he was taking her measure, just as she had taken his. Later, in her private chambers, Polino brought up the day's financial reports. More losses, more setbacks. The cost of maintaining even a small population of human workers would strain their dwindling resources. We could sell some of them, he suggested reluctantly. The crack's thigh would pay well, especially for the stronger ones. No. Marisol's fluke slapped the arm of her chair. My father opposed this entire operation because he believed in doing what was right, not what was expedient. I will not dishonor his memory by breaking my word. Then we must find other ways to rebuild, my lady. The old trading routes are close to us now. Marisol stared out at Earth again, thinking of Marcus Carpenter's steady gaze. Then we'll make new ones. These humans survived underground for months, living on nothing but their wits. Perhaps they can teach us something about adaptation. She didn't notice then, but it would later seem significant. That was the first time anyone had suggested learning from humanity, rather than simply abusing them. High above, Earth continued its slow rotation, its scars already gradually fading, as nature began the long process of healing. But some changes would prove permanent, reshaping both the conquered and their conquerors. Genora Fusseldorf's fluke scattered soil as she dropped to her knees, carefully examining the dying plants. The agridome's filtered sunlight cast strange shadows through the withering leaves. Something was wrong with the nitrogen cycle again, the third failure this season. Her dorsal ridge ached from hours of bending and checking soil samples, but they couldn't afford another failed crop. The bacteria aren't fixing properly, Diane Carpenter said, kneeling beside her. The human's hands moved with practical ease through the soil, checking moisture levels and root structures. We need to adjust the pH. Genora fought back her frustration. 20 years ago, her family owned this entire continent. Now they worked a single failing dome, struggling to meet production quotas that grew more demand each season. Their only remaining possession of value was Diane herself, though Genora hated thinking of her that way. The amendment minerals are too expensive. Genora's fluke slapped the ground in agitation. The new baron doubled the tariffs again. Diane's weathered face showed no reaction. She'd been with the family since before Genora was born, inherited along with their last remaining property, when the creditors stripped away everything else. Her father had been among the first group of humans acquired by the House Fusseldorf. A child amongst them then, and Diane herself had been born into it and grown up learning agriculture alongside Genora's parents. We can make our own amendments, Diane said quietly, pulling a small data pad from her work vest. I've been studying soil chemistry. The basic compounds are available in the local rock. We just need to process them correctly. Genora's blowhole fluttered in surprise. Where did you get access to chemical databases? Your mother's old education files. They were still loaded in the dome system. Diane's lips quirked slightly. Nobody bothered to restrict them after the transfer of ownership. Probably didn't think a human would understand them anyway. A decade ago, Genora would have been shocked by such initiative from a human worker. But necessity had worn away old prejudices. Diane wasn't just their only remaining slave. She was the only reason they'd survived this long. Her knowledge of Earth agriculture had proven invaluable when they'd been forced to take up farming themselves. Show me, Genora said, moving closer to see the datapad screen. The chemical formula was complex, but Diane's annotations made the process clear. This could work, but we'd need equipment. I can modify the old water filters. The basic principles are similar. Diane hesitated. Though technically I'm not supposed to handle complex machinery without supervision. Genora snorted water vapor through her blowhole. Technically, I'm supposed to be living in a mansion and attending diplomatic functions, not digging in the dirt. Times change. They worked through the afternoon, Diane explaining the chemical processes while Genora calculated production rates. The human's knowledge was impressive, far beyond what most would expect from a simple agriculture slave. But then, the Carpenter family had always been different. They'd maintained their dignity, even in servitude, finding ways to learn and grow, despite the restrictions placed upon them. Their quiet work was interrupted by heavy footsteps approaching through the dome's entrance. Genora's fluke tensed as she recognized the distinctive gait of a cracked thigh enforcer. They'd been coming more frequently lately, looking for any excuse to leave eye fines or impose new restrictions. "Lady Fuseldorf?" The announcer's voice dripped with mock courtesy, his horn plates gleaming under the dome lights. "Routine inspection, though I see you're still violating workforce regulations. Humans aren't authorized to handle technical documentation." Diane smoothly tucked the datapad away, keeping her eyes down as expected. But Genora noticed her hands were steady, no sign of fear most humans showed around Crack's thigh. "She's assisting me with soil analysis," Genora said carefully, "as my family's poverty." "Your family status was revoked," the enforcer interrupted. "You operate under standard colonial regulations now. The human should be in the general labor pool, not assigned exclusively to one farm. We have proper documentation, which expires at the end of the season." The enforcer's mouth, plates clicked in satisfaction. "Unless you meet new production quotas, of course. But given your current difficulties," Genora felt her chest squeeze. They couldn't lose Diane. Not just because she was their most knowledgeable worker, but because she was family in all but name. They'd grown up together, shared meals and work and hardship. "We'll meet the quotas," she said firmly. The enforcer made a sound suspiciously like a laugh. "We'll see. Good day, Citizen Fisseldorf." After he left, Diane stood slowly. "They don't care about quotas. The new Baron wants this land. They're looking for excuses. I know." Genora's fluke dug into the soil, another stressed gesture she'd never quite overcome. "But we have 3 months until inspection. If your mineral process works, it will," Diane said simply. Then more quietly, "My grandfather chose to stay with your family when he could have run. My father taught me why. Whatever happened, we face it together." Genora looked at their failing crops, their jury-rigged equipment, their single small dome among the massive agricultural complexes that now surrounded them. So little remained of their former greatness. But something new had grown in its place. A bond forged by shared labor and mutual respect. "Together then," she agreed. "Let's get to work on those minerals." Above them, the dome's atmospheric processors hummed steadily, maintaining the careful balance of gases needed for Earth crops to grow on an alien world. Like plants themselves, they would find a way to adapt and survive. Orbital dawn painted Delphus Fisseldorf's agri-domes in sheets of rose-gold light. From his observation platform, the vast array of interconnected structures stretched to the horizon, each one a testament of 2 generations of careful growth and innovation. His own dorsal ridge cast a long shadow across the polished deck plates as he reviewed the morning's production reports. Dome Complex 17, showing another record yield. His operations director, Vexari, noted. The younger Cestian skin bore the characteristic moistness of their species' excitement. That's the third consecutive season they've exceeded projections. And the human accident rates? Though he already knew the answer. 0 reportable incidents in the primary cultivation zones. 2 minor injuries in maintenance, both treated on site. Vexari's fluke twitched. The cracked thigh inspectors are calling it impossible. They're demanding another audit. Delphus released a soft spray of vapor. Let them audit. Our records are clear. Proper rest periods, adequate nutrition, stable work groups. Basic dignity costs less than constantly replacing injured workers. They watched a maintenance crew emerge from one of the distant domes, a mix of human and Cestians, working together with practiced efficiency. Even from this distance, their comfortable familiarity was obvious. No overseers with shock prods, no chains or restraints, just people doing their jobs. The Harvest Council is meeting next week, Vexari said carefully. There's talk of investigating our unusual practices again. Let them investigate. Our yields speak for themselves. Delphus turned to face his subordinate directly. Do you know why the other operations have such high failure rates? They blame human sabotage, claim the slaves deliberately damage equipment, or spoil crops. Exactly. They assume humans are inherently hostile, so they treat them as enemies. Then they're surprised when that treatment produces exactly the behavior they feared. Delphus gestured towards another dome, where a class was in session. Older humans teaching younger ones about soil chemistry and atmospheric regulation. We give them a stake in our success. The results are obvious. The Carpenter family had taught them that lesson generations ago. Now their descendants served as section managers and technical specialists throughout the operation. Other human families had followed similar paths, rising through the ranks based on merit rather than birthright. It wasn't freedom. The law still classified them as property, but it was a different kind of servitude than most humans knew. A soft chime announced another visitor. Rylan Carpenter emerged from the cliff, datapad in hand. Like many modern humans in Fieseldorf's operations, he wore practical work clothes rather than slave garments. His dark features were creased with concern. Lord Fieseldorf, he said, using the honorary title that had no legal standing anymore. We've had another request for our cultivation protocols, the Maxrian Consortium this time, trying to replicate our success, Delphus asked. They want the technical specifications for our soil management systems. Not, of course, the training programs that make them work. Delphus made a sound that in his species passed for laughter. Of course not. They want fruit without planting the tree. He paused, noting Ryland's continued unease. There's something else. News from the mining colonies. More riots. The crack's thigh response was harsh. The atmosphere in the room cooled noticeably. Everyone knew about conditions in the mines. The crack's thigh worked their humans literally to death, importing more whenever their population dropped too low. It was technically legal, but how many? Delphus asked quietly. At least 300 dead, mostly older workers and children. Ryland's voice strayed professional, but his hands gripped the datapad tightly. There's talk of more uprisings spreading to other facilities. Vexari shifted uncomfortably. That's not our concern. We can't interfere with other houses' property management. No, Delphus agreed. But we can ensure our own practices remain above reproach. Rylan, increase the education program budget by 20%. I want every human in our operation fully trained on at least 2 technical systems. The Harvest Council won't like that, Vexari warned. The Harvest Council doesn't feed half the sector, Delphus countered. Our methods work. Eventually others will have to accept that. As the others left, Delphus remained at the viewport, watching his domes glitter in the morning light. His great-grandmother has started this, treating humans as people rather than tools. His grandmother had expanded, creating the education programs. His mother had refined it into their current system, each generation building on the last, creating something unique in the galaxy. A place where humans could learn respect through ability, rather than just fear. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't freedom, but it was a beginning. A transport ship passed overhead, briefly shadowing the platform. Somewhere in the mines, humans died in darkness. Somewhere in the wealthy sectors, they served as a status symbol. But here, in these domes, something different was growing. Something that would change more than just crop yields. Delphus checked the production reports one final time before heading to his next meeting. The numbers were clear. Dignity yielded better returns than fear. Eventually, economics would force others to learn that lesson too. He hoped it wouldn't take too many more debts before they did. The legislative chamber in New Satisha bore little resemblance to the Grand Council Hall, where humanity's fate had been decided generations ago. Its architecture favored function over grandeur. Clean lines of composite minerals rather than ornate stonework. Practically atmosphere controls instead of towering ceilings. Yet Maris Fisseldor found it intimidating as she prepared to address the assembled representatives. "The numbers don't lie," she began, her dorsal ridge straight, despite her nervousness. Worlds that have adopted our agricultural protocols show consistent improvement in productivity. The correlation between human working conditions and economic output is undeniable. Hollow projections flickered above the chamber floor, displaying decades of carefully gathered data, crop yields, industrial efficiency ratings, worker longevity statistics, each chart telling the same story from a different angle. The cracks die, delegations rejects these findings. A heavily plated figure rumbled from the opposition section. "Our methods have served us adequately for generations. Your methods result in 40% annual worker death rate," Maris countered, bringing up new figures. "You spend more replacing dead humans than we spend training living ones. It's not just cruel, it's wasteful." A ripple of murmurs passed through the chamber. Challenging the cracks die openly was practically unheard of. But 3 generations of success had earned the Fisseldor family something their ancestors had lost: legitimate influence. "This is more than just a question of economics," Maris continued. "Every sapient species represented here has basic legal protections. Even our food animals have standard of care. Yet humans, who demonstrate intelligence equal to our own, are classified as pure property. Because they are," another representative cuts in. The invasion proved that they would fight to protect their homes." Maris interrupted. "As would any of us. But in the decades since, how many human uprisings have occurred in operations that treat them with respect? How many acts of sabotage in facilities that provide education and fair compensation?" She brought up even more data, security reports spanning 50 years of agriculture operations. The contrast between different management approaches was stark. Moving through the gathered representatives was Drake Carpenter. His presence here itself, a testament to change. As Chief Operational Advisor to the Fisseldorf Enterprises, he had earned the right to attend legislative sessions, though he still couldn't formally address them. Their eyes met briefly as he took his position near her podium. His expressions were carefully neutral. but she could read the tension in his stance. They'd spent months preparing for this moment, knowing they would have one chance to change generations of established law. "I propose," Maris raised her voice slightly, "a basic standard of human rights. Nothing extreme, simply fundamental protections against abuse, requirements for adequate care, and the right to earn status through merit." The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. The Crack's Thigh delegation's horn plates clicked in agitation, while various merchant representatives frantically calculated the economic implications. "You would upend centuries of established order," the Crack's Thigh speaker growled. "Next you'll suggest letting them vote." "I suggest preventing waste of valuable resources," Maris replied evenly. "Your own financial reports show the cost of constantly replacing workers. Our methods produce better results at lower cost. That's not ideology. It's simple economics. It's simple economics." She felt the Drake shift slightly beside her, a subtle signal they'd arranged. Support was building among the merchant houses. The Crack's Thigh influence was strong, but credit spoke louder than tradition. A test program, perhaps, one of the merchant representatives offered. Limited to agricultural operations initially. Unacceptable, the Crack's Thigh speakers started, but others were already joining in. Voluntary participation, incentives for early adoption, graduated implementation. Maris kept her expression neutral as the debate continued, but she saw Drake's hands clenched slightly. They both knew that would happen. The merchants would support basic protections because it would save them money. The more progressive houses would expand on that foundation. Change would come slowly, unevenly, but it would come. The final vote passed by a narrow margin. The protections were basic. Restrictions on physical punishment, standards for food and rest periods, limited rights to earn additional privileges through service. But it was a beginning. "It's not enough," Drake said quietly as they left the chamber hours later. "These protections still treat humans as property, just property that has to be maintained properly." "It's a first step," Maris replied. "Change comes gradually." "Then suddenly, you taught me that." He nodded slowly. The phrase was from one of the human books they'd studied together as children. Technically illegal material that the Fieseldorf family had preserved in their educational databases. "My great-grandfather used to say, 'The freedom grows like crops,'" Drake said. "You plant the seeds, tend them carefully, and trust in the harvest." Maris released a soft spray of vapor, appreciation for the agricultural metaphor. "Your family has always understood patience. 3 generations you've worked with mine, each step building on the last. And now we've planted something new. Let's see what grows from it." They parted ways. Drake to the transport that would return him to the agricultural complexes. Maris to meet the other representatives about implementation details, both knowing that today's small victory could ripple outwards in ways few could predict. In the centuries since humans' enslavement, this was the first formal acknowledgement of their right as thinking beings. It wasn't much, applying to only one world. But like a crack in a dam, even small changes can lead to a flood. The question was whether that flood could bring destruction or transformation. Kayla Fieseldorf watched her family's agricultural empire burn. From the observation deck of their last remaining shuttle, the massive domes had taken generations to build, collapse one by one as riots swept through the complex. Emergency lights strobed across clouds of smoke and venting atmosphere, painting everything in surreal pulses of red and white. "Mining colonies are in full revolt," her chief security reported, his fluke twitching with barely contained stress. The Crack's Thigh response forces were overwhelmed. Someone gave the humans access to military-grade weapons. Someone always does, Kayla said quietly. 3 years of escalating civil war has taught her that every defeat created new weapons. Every victory sparked new resistance. The carefully controlled changes her mother had championed had exploded into galaxy-wide conflict. The main communications array crackled. Incoming transmission from Complex 7. Put it through. Theon Carpenter's face appeared on the nearest screen, smokes and sparks visible behind him. Like many humans now, he wore no slave markings or identification tags. His eyes held a mixture of determination and regret. "We've secured the primary storage silos," he reported, "but we can't hold them. The crack thigh bombardment is too heavy." "You shouldn't have to." Kayla's blowhole released a sharp spray of vapor. "Those were your people attacking. The Liberation Front aren't my people." Theon cut in sharply. "My people build those domes with your family. My people worked for real change, not this bloodbath." His expression softened slightly. "But I can't stop them. No one can now." Another explosion rocked the complex. On other screens, Kayla could see similar scenes playing out across dozens of worlds. The Liberation Front had launched coordinated strikes everywhere humans were held, arming them with weapons smuggled by sympathetic merchants or stolen from military depots. The crack thigh and their allies responded with overwhelming force, treating every human as a potential insurgent. Caught in the middle were operations like Fieseldorf's farms, places where humans and aliens had learned to work together, where change had been happening naturally. Now those careful decades of progress were literally going up in smoke. "You should go," Theon said, glancing over his shoulder at something off-screen. "More crack thigh ships incoming. They won't distinguish between humans and those who worked with them." "Come with us," Kayla offered, knowing what his answer would be. He shook his head. "Can't abandon my post. Someone has to protect the seed vaults. Everything we developed together. Drought-resistant strains, atmospheric adapters, it's all there. Future is going to need that knowledge once all this burning is done." "Theon," a security chief interrupted. "My lady, we need to break orbit now. Enemy vessels approaching weapon range." Kayla stared at the screen, at this human whose family had been entwined with hers for generations. "Theon, we knew this might happen," he said. "Too much pressure built up over too many years. Had to break somewhere." "Theon," he managed a slight smile. "But we proved it could work. Humans and aliens together, building something worthwhile. Maybe when the fighting's done, someone will remember that." The screen went dark as Complex 7's communications array took a direct hit. Kaylee watched flames spread through the agricultural sector where she'd grown up, where she'd learned about crops and chemistry alongside human children who became lifelong friends. "Course heading?" the pilot asked. "Neutral territories," Kayla decided. "What's left of the merchant fleas are gathering there, away from both the Liberation Front and the Cracksthigh forces." As they broke orbit, she pulled up the latest news feeds. The Liberation Front was claiming victories on a dozen worlds. The Cracksthigh were responding with orbital bombardments. The merchant houses were choosing sides or fleeing to neutral space. And somewhere in that chaos, the old dream of peaceful cooperation was being buried under the weight of centuries of accumulated hatred. "Play the archival file," she ordered. "Security code, Fieseldorf Prime." The ship's computer acknowledged, bringing up footage from decades ago, her mother's speech to the legislative chamber, arguing for the first human rights laws. It seemed impossibly naive now, thinking they could manage change through careful regulations and economic incentives. But as she watched her mother speak about dignity yielding better returns than fear, Kyla understood something new. They hadn't failed because their ideas were wrong. They'd failed because they'd tried to compromise with a fundamentally broken system. Real change couldn't come through adjusting the rules of slavery. It had to come through breaking those rules entirely. Her security chief approached cautiously. The Craxthi are demanding we denounce the human rebels. They're calling in old debts, reminding everyone about our ancestors' opposition to the original invasion. Let them, Kyla said. We've spent generations trying to walk the middle path. Look where it got us. She stared out at the stars, thinking of Theon defending the seed vaults, of all the knowledge and cooperation they'd built together. It wasn't lost, not completely. Its time simply hadn't come yet. Send a message to the merchant fleet, she ordered. The Fieseldorf family offers sanctuary to any humans fleeing the combat zones. We'll face the consequences. The security chief's fluke slapped the deck in agitation. The Craxthi will declare us enemies of order. The Craxthi declared themselves enemies of progress long ago, Kyla replied. We just took too long to accept it. Their shuttle accelerated away from the burning world, carrying with it generations of dreams and cooperation. Behind them, humanity fought for its freedom, with stolen weapons and desperate courage. Ahead light uncertainty, and perhaps, eventually, a chance to rebuild what was being lost in fire and blood. Kyla thought of Theon's words about remembering. Perhaps that would be their family's final legacy, not as power brokers or agricultural barons, but as living proof that cooperation was possible, if anyone survived to care about such proof. Kyla Fieseldorf's aged fluke trembled slightly as she adjusted her Hoover chair's controls, bringing it closer to the observation window of her modest apartment. The sprawling city below had changed so much in the decades since they'd fled here. What had once been a minor trading port in the neutral territories had become the de facto capital of the Universal Life Federation. The cityscape reflected its new status. Elegant spires designed for aviation species rose alongside pressure-doomed habitats for aquatic races. Environmental bubbles maintained dozens of different atmospheric combinations, allowing species from across the galaxy to live and work together. And everywhere, humans walked freely among them. Her blowhole released a wheezing spray, old age making even that simple function difficult. On the news feeds floating beside her window, 3 different conflicts played out simultaneously. The Liberation Front had splintered years ago, giving rise to the Human Planetary League, extremists who preached human supremacy and xenophobic isolation. They fought both the remaining anti-human forces and the Universal Life Federation, claiming any alien who had ever supported slavery deserves death. More reports from the Craxthi border, her medical attendant said softly. Young Astrid Carpenter still maintained the family tradition of service, though now it was freely given rather than compelled. The HPL has taken 3 more systems. Show me, Kayla requested, her voice thin but clear. The feeds shifted to show human warships, designed, stolen, and improved upon over decades of conflict, systematically dismantling the defenses of Craxthi mining world. The HPL's tactics were ruthlessly efficient, born from generations of accumulated knowledge about their former master's weakness. They're evaluating civilians, at least, Astrid noted, checking Kayla's vital signs with practiced ease. The Federation's influence seems to be moderating their worst impulses. Some of them, Kayla agreed. But watch their ground forces. The feeds zoomed in on landing operations. Human troops moved with devastating precision, and defensive positions with weapons specifically designed to pierce Craxthi armor plates. There was no mercy in their advance. No quarter offered to their former oppressors. Grandmother used to say dignity yielded better returns than fear, Kayla amused. I wonder what she'd think of this. Humans proving just as capable of cruelty as any species that enslaved them. Not all humans, Astrid reminded her gently. The Federation grows stronger every day. More worlds joining. More species working together as equals. True enough, the Universal Life Federation had grown from a handful of refugee settlements into a genuine power, offering an alternative to both human supremacy and the old order. But the cost had been enormous. Elite systems laid waste, centuries of accumulated knowledge lost in the fighting, in the shadow of ancient wrongs poisoning every attempt at reconciliation. A soft chime announced another visitor. Kayla wasn't surprised to see Theon's grandson, Reed Carpenter, stepped through the door. The young man's dark features bore little resemblance to his grandfather, but his bearing carried the same quiet dignity. "The council is meeting," he reported without preamble. "The HPL's latest advances have them scared. They're talking about preemptive strikes. They're fools." Kayla's fluke slapped her chair's armrest. The League would use that as an excuse to abandon all pretense of restraint. How many Federation's worlds would die in this crossfire? Reed nodded grimly. "That's why I'm here. They want your testimony about the early days, about how cooperation between species was possible, even under the slave system. They think it might help moderate the hardliners." Kayla made a sound that might have been a laugh in her youth. "They want me to tell them how my family grew rich from human labor, how we congratulated ourselves on being benevolent masters while still owning thinking beings as property. They want you to tell them about the seed vaults," Reed said quietly, "about how humans and aliens work together to create something lasting, about proof that coexistence is possible." Kayla's aged eyes fixed on the city outside. Somewhere in the Federation's secure archives, the agricultural innovations her family developed with the Carpenters were helping feed dozens of worlds. The same knowledge that Theon had died protecting now sustained the dream of a truly united galaxy. "Very well," she said finally. "Help me prepare for transport. The Council should hear how this all began, not to excuse the past, but to understand how we might still shape the future." As Reed and Astrid helped her into a more formal hover chair, Kayla watched military updates scroll past on the news feeds. The HBL's forces advancing, the cracked thigh retreating, the Federation trying to maintain peace with increasingly limited success, all of it flowing from that first fateful vote generations ago when the galaxy had chosen fear over understanding. "We thought we could control them," she said softly, more to herself than to her attendants. "The Council, the cracked thigh, even my own family. We all thought we could harness humanity's strength while containing their spirit. Instead, they learned from us, adapted our technologies, absorbed our knowledge, and turned it all back against us. Just as that first representative warned they would. But not all of us," Astrid reminded her, adjusting the chair's medical settings. "Some of us learned to work together instead." "Yes," Kayla agreed, "and perhaps that's the most important lesson we can share with the Council. The galaxy voted to enslave humanity out of fear. Now they beg for mercy out of the same fear. But there is another path, the one my family fought and died for. Cooperation. Respect. True equality." She gestured towards the window, where ships of dozen designs move through carefully coordinated traffic patterns. "We can still build something worthy together, if we're brave enough to try it." The Hoover chair hummed to life, carrying her towards the council chambers, where she would tell her family's story one final time. Not for absolution. Their sins were too deep for that, but for understanding, for hope that the future might learn from the past's mistake. Outside, the city gleamed in the light of an alien sun, its very existence a testament to possibilities no one had imagined when humanity's fate was first decided. Whatever came next would be shaped by choices made now, just as the present had been shaped by choices made then. Kayla only hoped they would choose more wisely this time. The broadcast signal cut through every channel, every feed, every communications network in settled space. Norrin Fieseldorf sat rigid in his office chair, blowhole clenched tight, as the scene unfolded on his display. Around him, the Federation trading hub's normal activity had ground to a halt, as everyone, human and alien alike, watched in horrified fascination. The old council chamber looked exactly as historical records depicted it. The same towering architecture, the same colon-centric rings of seats, the same podium where humanity's enslavement had been decreed generations ago. But now, those seats held very different occupants. The surviving council members knelt in a row, their diverse anatomies forced into poses of submission. Behind them stood black-armored human troops bearing the insignia of the Planetary League. Their weapons were ceremonial rather than practical, ancient projectile rifles that once had armed Earth's military forces. A fitting venue, a voice declared off-camera. The same room where you condemned our species to chains. The same podium from which you pronounced judgment. The same seats where you voted away our freedom. The leader stepped into view. Augustus Vale, Supreme Commander of the Human Planetary League. His dress uniform was immaculate, his bearing almost aristocratic. Nothing in his manner suggested the brutality of his campaigns against alien worlds. For centuries, you held authority over this chamber, he continued. Now we hold authority over you. The question is, what judgment shall we pronounce? A murmur ran through Norrin's office as another figure entered the frame. Brendan Mace, High Commissioner of the Universal Life Federation's Human Affairs Council. His presence here made no sense. The Federation and League were supposed to be better enemies. The Federation sanctioned this. Norrin's aide whispered in disbelief. Impossible, Norrin replied, but doubt crept into his voice. The Federation's human members had been growing increasingly hardline in recent years, pushing for stronger action against former slave-holding powers. On screen, Mace took his position beside Vale. The Universal Life Federation and the Human Planetary League have reached an understanding. While we may differ on methods, we agree that the old order must be completely dismantled, starting with its symbols of power. One of the council members, a Cracksthigh noble whose horn plates had been deliberately shattered, found their voice. You speak of dismantling the old order while embracing its worst aspects. Look at yourself, acting out the same cruelties you once condemned. No. Vale's smile was terrifying in its gentleness. We're not acting out cruelties. We're serving justice. There's a difference. The difference, Mace added, is that we're not enslaving you. We're not working you to death in mines. We're not taking your children as property. We're simply ending your ability to ever do those things again. The implications hung in the air for a moment before Vale raised his hand. The soldiers raised their rifles, primitive weapons chosen deliberately for this historic significance. Wait. Another council member tried to rise, but was forced to back down. We can negotiate. The Federation's principles are not at an issue here, Mace interrupted. This isn't a Federation action. This is humanity, all of humanity, Serving notice. The old order ends today. You can't. The cracks the nobles started. The rifles cracked in perfect unison. Noran's aide turned away, but Noran forced himself to watch. His species had adapted to process visual information in extreme detail. Every moment burned itself into his memory. The council members' deaths were quick, at least. The weapons might have been primitive, but the soldiers' aim was precise. When it was done, Vale turned to address the camera directly. To all those watching, remember this moment. Remember what humanity speaks with one voice when it comes to justice for past wrongs. Remember that while the Federation and League may disagree on many things, we are united in ensuring the old powers never rise again. The broadcast cut off abruptly, leaving every screen in the trading hub dark for a moment before regular programming resumed. But no one moved to change channels or resume their duties. The implications were too staggering. They were working together all along. Noran's aide whispered. The League's advances. The Federation's diplomatic pressure. It was coordinated. Not all along, Noran corrected. His maritime ancestry showing in ways his skin has paled. But long enough, the Federation's human members must have reached some agreement with the League. A limited partnership to destroy their common enemy. But the Federation stands for equality, for cooperation between species. And how many humans in the Federation truly trust that cooperation? Noran's fluke trembled slightly. How many still carry generations of resentment? The League offered them something the Federation couldn't. Revenge. Around them, humans and aliens alike were beginning to move again, but differently now. Entries of careful integration suddenly felt fragile. Even here, in the heart of Federation space, old fears were awakening. Sent a message to our security chief. Noran ordered, double-check the guards on all sensitive facilities and get me a secure channel to Federation headquarters. Someone there must be able to explain what we just witnessed. But his aide hurried to comply. Noran wondered if any explanation would be sufficient. The galaxy had just watched humanity's two opposing factions work together to execute their former masters. The message was clear. Humans might fight among themselves, but they would unite against their ancient oppressors. More concerning still was what this revealed about the Federation itself. How many other secret agreements existed? How many other carefully maintained principles would be sacrificed to expedience? Outside his windows, ships continued their normal patterns through the trading hub's crowded lanes. But now he noticed how the human vessels seemed to move with particular confidence, while others gave them slightly wider berth than necessary. The old order had just died in the council chamber. What would replace it remained to be seen. The University of New Satisha prided itself on being the most progressive institution in Federation space. Its campus seemingly integrated environmental systems for dozens of species. Its faculty represented over 30 different civilizations, and its commitment to universal equality was literally carved into the stone arch above its main entrance. Knowledge knows no species. It's the same. Petra Fieseldorf found it all rather hypocritical. She watched from her small office as students moved between classes. Her sleek cetacean form was barely distinguishable from her ancestors, despite generations of genetic drift. But everything else about her life would have been unrecognizable to them. Her family name carried no special weight now. She earned her position in the xenosociology department through merit alone. A soft tone announced her next appointment. Right on schedule, an undergraduate student entered. a young cracked thigh whose hornplate still showed adolescent softness. "Professor Fieseldorf, about my thesis proposal. Have a seat, Tarn." She gestured to the chair designed to accommodate his species' rigid backbone. "I read your outline. The methodology seems sound, but I have concerns about your underlying assumptions." The student's plates clicked nervously. "Is it the sample size? I can expand the survey pool. It's your premise." Petra interrupted gently. "You're trying to prove that humans have inherently aggressive tendencies by studying their recreational activities, but you're only looking at contact sports and combat simulations. You're ignoring their music, their art, their community gatherings. But those aggressive tendencies are well documented," Tarn protested. "Even Federation military reports show that human soldiers are more likely to engage in high-risk combat maneuvers. And the crime statistics are heavily skewed by reporting bias." Petra finished. "How many times have you personally witnessed humans starting fights in the student quarter?" "Well, none. But you've heard stories. Everyone's heard stories." Petra's fluke twitched in frustration. "That's exactly that kind of circular reasoning we need to avoid in academic work." The student's posture stiffened defensively. "Professor Trellick says we should acknowledge evolutionary history and sociological analysis. Humans have evolved as pursuit predators on a death world. That has to affect their behavior. Professor Trellick," Petra said carefully, "allows his personal experiences during war to color his academic judgment." She pulled up a different set of statistics on her display. "Look at graduation rates, professional certification, artistic achievements. Humans excel in dozens of fields that have nothing to do with physical prowess or aggression. Yet we focus overwhelmingly on their capacity for violence." "The League," Tarn began. "The Human Planetary League hasn't launched a major offensive in 15 years. Petra countered. "They've splintered into independent colonies, most of which are more interested in trade than conquest. Yet we still treat every human as a potential threat." She gestured out her window where a human student sat reading under a tree, completely ignored by his peers. No one was openly hostile that would violate university policy. But the subtle spacing of the other students, the careful way they moved around him without making eye contact, told its own story. "Do you know why I chose xenosociology?" she asked. Tarn's plates shifted in the equivalent of a headshake. "Because my family spent generations proving that cooperation as between species was possible, that treating others with dignity produced better results than fear or force. Now, we live in a society that preaches equality while practicing 1,000 little forms of exclusion." She turned back to her student. "If you want to study human behavioral patterns, I'll help you design a proper methodology. But first, you need to acknowledge your own biases. We all do." The student left looking thoughtful, if unconvinced. Petra watched him go, noting how he unconsciously gave the human student under the tree a wide berth. Her next appointment wasn't for an hour, so she pulled up the historical archives. Images of her ancestors filled the screen. The first Fieseldorf to oppose humanity's enslavement. The generation that built cooperation through agriculture. The elderly Kayla speaking to the Federation Council. A message notification blinked in her peripheral vision. Another colleague politely declined to co-author a paper on human cultural integration. The reasons were always professional, always carefully worded, but the subtext was clear. Studying humans objectively was career suicide. Outside, the human student had been joined by others of a species. They sat silently apart from the main crowd, talking quietly among themselves, not segregated by rule or law, but by custom and unspoken agreement. Petra's research showed the pattern repeated everywhere. Humans could achieve any position in Federation society, but they had to be exceptional to do so. They could live anywhere, but housing computers somehow always showed fewer available units to human applicants. They could study any subject, but their classmates would subtly edge away in laboratories and study groups. It was all perfectly legal, all technically compliant with Federation principles of equality. But the old fears remained, wrapped in new language. Humans weren't violent anymore. They were high energy or physically oriented. They weren't dangerous. They were intense or overwhelming. The same prejudices that once justified slavery now justified 1,000 small exclusions. The same fears that had once built chains now built invisible walls. A final message notification caught her attention. The university's diversity committee requesting her participation in yet another cultural sensitivity workshop. The irony was almost painful. Petra began composing her response, carefully choosing words that would challenge without threatening. It was tedious work, pushing against centuries of accumulated bias. But her family always understood that real change required patience. Outside her window, the human students continued their quiet conversation, unconsciously maintaining their bubble of separation in the crowded courtyard. The university's motto gleamed above them in afternoon sunlight. Knowledge knows no species. Such pretty words, such persistent shadows. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Universal Life Federation had never been so full. Bodies of every shape and size packed the tiered seating, environmental bubbles humming as they maintained survival conditions for dozens of species. The press section buzzed with activity. Cameras and sensors focused on the central podium where history was about to be made. Marina Fieseldorf felt her husband's hand squeeze her fluke gently as they waited in the preparation chamber. Dominic Carpenter's dark features showed the same mix of anticipation and nervousness she felt rippling through her own cetacean form. The feeds are all live in all territories, their media coordinator reported, even picking up unofficial broadcasts in league space. Marina's blowhole released a soft spray of vapor. How many times have her family stood in chambers like this, always trying to change mind, change laws, change hearts? This time's different, Dominic said quietly. The League's collapse changed everything. Without that external threat, people have to face their internal fears. The coordinator's communicator chimed. "You're on in 5 minutes." Marina checked her translation implant one final time. The speech they prepared would be broadcast in every major language simultaneously. Not just translated, actually delivered in each tongue, thanks to the neural harmonics they spent months practicing. Through the chamber's doors, they could hear the assembly president making introductions. Their title seemed to go on forever. Marina Fieseldorf, Chair of Interspecies Relations at Federation University of New Cestia. Dominic Carpenter, Director of Historical Reconciliations for the Human Rights Commission. First cross-species marriage between their respective families. "Ready?" Dominic asked as the doors began to open, Marina's fluke wrapped around his waist, a gesture that would have scandalized society a generation ago. Together, they emerged into bright light and a wave of sound. The assembly hall's perfect acoustics caught every rustle, click, and murmur from the diverse audience. Marina felt, rather than saw, the subtle shifting as various species reacted to their public display of affection. The podium adjusted automatically to accommodate both their forms as they took position. Marina's secondary eyelids filmed briefly as she scanned the crowd. So many faces, scaled, furred, plated, smooth, all wanting to hear what the descendant of privilege and the descendant of slaves would say about the future. Dominic spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of generations. We come before you today not to denounce the past, but to imagine a future. Not to assign blame, but to accept responsibility. Not to divide, but to unite. Marina continued seamlessly, their practice harmonics making the words flow in every language at once. For centuries, our families have stood as living proof that cooperation is possible, that differences can become strengths, that fear can give way to understanding. But proof is not enough. Dominic's tone shifted slightly. Understanding is not enough. We must move beyond tolerance into true acceptance, beyond cooperation into genuine community. Across the vast chamber, Marina saw humans and aliens alike, leaning forward. In the press section, she recognized descendants of both the Liberation Front and the old noble houses, all equally intent on their words. Look around you, she gestured to the assembled crowd. Every species here evolved through struggle. Every civilization has emerged from conflict. We are all products of survival, of adaptation, of the drive to overcome limitations. But we are also all capable of growth, Dominic added, of moving past our evolutionary programming, of choosing cooperation over competition, understanding over fear. Together their voices merged in harmony. We stand before you as proof that the boundaries between species are illusions, that the divisions we maintain exist only because we choose to maintain them. Marina felt Dominic's hand find her fluke again as they moved into the heart of their message. The League's collapse has left us without external enemies to blame for our divisions. No, we must confront the barriers we maintain within our own society. The subtle exclusions, the unspoken biases, the comfort distance we keep from those who seem too different. We dream. Dominic's voice carried echoes of ancient human orators, of a federation where no child grows up feeling less worthy because of their species, where no person must be exceptional to be accepted, where diversity truly means celebration rather than mere tolerance. We dream, Marina continued, of a society that has moved beyond its past without forgetting its lessons, that honors the struggles that brought us here while refusing to be chained by them. Their voices joined again. We dream of a future worthy of all of our ancestors' hopes, of a galaxy where our children, and yes, through modern science, we will have children, can live without the weight of history's fears. The chamber had fallen completely silent. Even the environmental units seemed to hum more quietly. This is not a dream that will be realized quickly, Marina acknowledged. Change comes slowly, then suddenly. We know this from history, but it begins with a choice, Dominic added, with each of us deciding what kind of future we will build. With every small action that breaks down old barriers and creates new connections. Our families chose cooperation when others chose fear. Marina's fluke tightened around Dominic's waist. Choose dignity over dominance. Choose to see possibility where others saw only threat. Now we ask you to choose. Dominic's eyes swept the assembly, not just with laws or policies, but with actions, with daily decisions about how you treat those who seem different, with conscious efforts to move past comfortable prejudices, because in the end, they finish together. We are all one community, all one future, all one dream. The silence held for a moment longer. Then, somewhere in the upper tiers, someone began to applaud. The sounds spread. Different appendages creating different percussive effects. Claws clicking, plates rattling, fins snapping. A symphony of species united in response. Marina felt tears in her eyes, real tears. not the performative moisture her species normally produced. Beside her, Dominic's hand trembled slightly against her fluke. They had said their piece, planted their seeds. Now it was up to the galaxy to choose what would grow from them. As they left the podium, Marina caught glimpses of faces in the crowd. Some moved, some thoughtful, some clearly uncomfortable. Change never came easily, but she remembered her ancestors' words about crops requiring patience and care. They had planted something today. Whether it would flower into their dream remained to be seen. But for now, for this moment, they had proved again what their families had always known, that differences could become strength, that fear could give way to hope, that the future belonged to those brave enough to imagine it differently. The dream lived on. The rest was up to those who would follow. As the assembly echoed with applause, Marina Fieseldorf and Dominic Carpenter knew the truth. Their families had not erased the past, but built something through it. Generation by generation, not power over, but power with, not suppression, but synthesis. What the galaxy chose next would not be born of fear, but of understanding. The harvest of hope had begun.